The United States and China have sought to end their trade war for now by agreeing to dramatically slash the tariffs they imposed on each other's goods. The development follows a successful round of talks in Switzerland at the weekend. Previously, the White House issued blanket levies on all Chinese imports into the US of 145%, with a variety of additional tariffs on specific goods. Retaliation from Beijing took their tariff rate on imports from America up to 125%. And in today's breakthrough, both sides agreed to lower levies by 115% for a 90-day period as negotiations continue. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said both sides saw the need for trade between the two powers to continue.
The consensus from both delegations this weekend is neither side wants a decoupling. And what had occurred with these very high tariffs, as Ambassador Greer said, was the equivalent of an embargo, and neither side wants that. We do want trade. We want more balanced trade, and I think that both sides are committed to achieving that.
Our China correspondent Laura Bicker is in Beijing. Our economics editor Faisal Islam is here in London. They join me, and I started by saying to Laura, there wasn't that much expectation around these talks that took place, only for 2 days over the weekend, so whether there was a sense of surprise that they'd reached a deal.
They were very low. Most analysts had expected them to talk and then come out and announce more talks. Well, they have done that. There's a 90-day pause, and China has emphasised that there's going to be this economic and trade mechanism for talks in the future. So perhaps, this is more talks about talks about talks. But they've come out with an agreement to lower these tariffs, which seems like a significant de-escalation from where we were last week. China has definitely softened its tone. Remember, it's been digging its heels in, utterly defiant. It will not back down, and it will fight this trade war to the end, has been the message from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs daily here in Beijing. However, behind the scenes, officials are growing increasingly concerned about the impact that these tariffs may have on the economy. Remember, China's economy is not growing as fast as it has done in the last 2 decades. It's facing significant challenges, high youth unemployment, a property crisis, and it's got a spending crisis. People don't want to put their hands in their pockets and spend money, and a global trade war is not going to encourage them to do that anymore. So officials here in Beijing saw the danger. They say the US initiated trade talks. Washington says the opposite. However, they have managed to sit down. They had like 7 or 8 hours of talks on Saturday, a few more on Sunday, and here we have this agreement. Yes, analysts are surprised. Now, I've been looking at reaction across different parts of China. Some see this as a glimmer of hope between the US and China going forward. However, others are slightly more cautious, saying they're doing a deal for now, but doing a wider trade deal over the next 90 days and trying to pin down the major problem, which is the US thinks that Beijing sells it far too much. Remember, China sells the US 4 times the amount than the US buys. So there's this major imbalance that Donald Trump does not like, that Donald Trump definitely wants to target. So getting to the bottom of a deal to balance that in a way that Washington and Beijing can agree on will be far more difficult.
In terms of the now, though, Faisal, this deal that has been struck, China also saying that these tariff cuts are in the common interests of the entire world. So what effect will this deal have not only on China and the US, but on the global economy?
Well, Lucy, you had the situation where the world's 2 biggest economies were kind of fronting up like rutting stags. And essentially, at over 100% tariffs, you have prohibitive levels of tariff. The trade simply wasn't flowing. And we've seen that in terms of the cross-Pacific traffic, cargo traffic, container ships going into ports like LA and Seattle, basically just drying up. And the few ships that were sailing having very little cargo on them at these prohibitive rates. There was some acknowledgement of that actually in terms of what we heard from the US and Chinese side. So what you've seen is a wind back from the additional tit-for-tat retaliation process that we saw really over the past month since so-called Liberation Day. And you're left trying to divine how much of this is going to go on. How much of this is an end to trade hostilities, an end to the trade war, or is it just a truce? and a ceasefire. And I think it's a little bit difficult to actually unpick because there's all sorts of different tariffs which are stacked upon each other, and you have to sort of decipher what's going on, and slightly different things are being said by the Chinese and the Americans. But the basic picture is this: those triple-digit tariffs are down to around 10% for now for 90 days, set to go up to about 30% after 90 days, depends on some sort of negotiation. These are still pretty high levels compared to normality, but they're obviously a lot better, not just for the two countries, but for the rest of the world, than had been 145%, for example. So that's where we stand. But I do not discern or divine from these statements that some of the things that the Americans targeted, for example, the subsidies that China offers to its industry, its exchange rate policy, all these sorts of, that they've managed to get rid of most of the tariffs and leave, if you like, 24% up for percentage points up for negotiation. There's also additional sectoral tariffs that apply to the rest of the world. They still will apply to China. There isn't much of a Chinese trade in cars with the US, for example, though, and that's one of the main areas. But we're still waiting for the tariffs on semiconductors, for example, or pharmaceuticals. So, there are still a lot of unknowns. This is a clear directional shift, as Laura says, away from what seems to be just ongoing escalating tit for tat. We're definitely in the de-escalation zone. What this does to the other participants in what is a global trade war, who now face the same tariff as China at 10% for 90 days, but prospectively could face higher tariffs after the end of this 90-day period, that is another question. And I'll just leave you with this, which is, it was said at the time when Chinese retaliated so aggressively, it was said by the White House, do not retaliate. That is the best strategy here, and perhaps the UK deal would be an example of that. Well, I think perhaps in Beijing they'll be thinking that the heavy retaliation, the like for like, the tit for tat, the dollar for dollar retaliation we've seen has brought the Americans to the table, partly because of the reaction of financial markets, bond markets in particular, about a month ago. That's when we saw the origins of this turnaround and what's come to fruition today via those talks in Geneva.
And Laura, just briefly, for ordinary Chinese people, you mentioned the economy is already struggling with the property crisis, youth unemployment's very high. I know you've travelled around the country talking to people. What are their concerns going forward?
I think the main concern, first of all, stability. I mean, we've been putting in calls here, and I know that my team have been speaking to a number of people to get their reaction. One person told us, okay, fine, about 50-60% of my business goes to the United States, but actually, even when they've lifted the tariffs, I don't care. And that is because I want stability. I might just look for other markets. What we have been finding is a lot of people still looking for other markets because they're worried, even if there's a ceasefire in this trade war for now, what happens in the future? What happens when Donald Trump and the United States decides to fall out with China again? I think there's a fear that this is an ongoing problem here in China. They've already diversified away much of their trade away from the United States. I think that's a trend that will continue.